this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to the World War II podcast. In this episode, we discuss the role of Macau, the Portuguese colony in South China, and the experiences of John Reeves, the British Consul stationed there. Despite Portugal's official neutrality, Macau found itself caught in the geopolitical struggles of the Pacific War. With Japanese forces surrounding the colony, John Reeves had the difficult task of representing British interests while navigating an increasingly precarious situation. His work included intelligence gathering, aiding refugees, and balancing diplomacy with survival in an environment where Japan's influence was ever present. I'm joined by Peter Rose, who is the author of The Good War of Consul Reeves, which focuses on wartime Macau. Thanks for joining me, Peter. For listeners, let's start with Macau. I suspect people will have heard of it, but cannot perhaps place a pin on the map where it is.
Macau is one of the most fascinating cities that I've ever studied or been to. It is a small Portuguese colony on the Pearl River Delta, about 35 miles west of Hong Kong, very close to Hong Kong. And it's been there forever. It was founded by a motley crew of priests and sailors during the great age of Portuguese exploration in 1557. In 1557, if you cast your mind back, for someone from England, it's 2 years before Elizabeth I went on the throne. It's 60 years before the Pilgrims arrived in the U.S. Michelangelo was carving marble in Florence. And they founded a small Portuguese town with town squares and Baroque churches and a cathedral and forts stuck there on the southern coast of China. And for 300 years, it was the most important Western city in that part of Asia. It was the way the trade between China, Japan, and the West took place, the Great Black Ship from Macau. It was the first Western university founded by the Jesuits, the first Western printing press, and they brought all the Jesuits through Macau, took all the knowledge of the West, mathematics, astronomy, Greek, philosophy, etc., and took it to the imperial court in Peking, as it was then. And then it was the only way that the West could trade with China. From about 1719 to 1841, the merchants could build warehouses in Canton, about 50 miles north of Macau. The goods were brought down the Pearl River and loaded into the clipper ships, the American, the British, the Swedish, the Danish ships in Macau harbor, and then sent around the world. The building that the head of the East India Company, his residence, is still there. It's now a museum in Hong Kong. And then 1841, the Opium Wars, Britain forcibly opened China up to trade. There was then suddenly 90 cities as opposed to one you could trade in China. And Macau fell into a quiet desuetude. So by 1935, there's about 150,000 people, an economy based on gambling and opium. The only thing it exported were fireworks, incense, and matches. And of course, Hong Kong, 35 miles east, became the dominant Western commercial hub of Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I went to Macau about 20 years ago, and I was curiously surprised in that sort of old part, how kind of Portuguese, sort of Spanish, it sort of felt still, some of the old buildings, as opposed to, because I went over from Hong Kong and it just felt really different.
Even today, so much has been demolished with ugly glass buildings. And of course, the major Las Vegas casinos have huge operations there. But there's parts that are still beautifully preserved. And you can turn a corner in Macau, and there's the city square, and there's the Baroque church, and there's the Angelus playing, and there's the fountain, and you'd swear you're in Lisbon or a Porto or somewhere like that. The streets in the blue Portuguese tiles with the Portuguese name and then the Chinese name, the name in Chinese characters underneath it.
So the Portuguese by the 30s, do they consider it an important overseas territory? I mean, in some respects, in many respects, the Portuguese empire is has been in decline. There's not a lot left. But do they? I'm always kind of more thinking. You think of there's Fortress Singapore for the British. Do the Portuguese have a lot there?
There's no evidence. By that stage, the Portuguese Empire, they had Mozambique, Brazil obviously is an independent nation. They weren't colonies in the sense of the way that the British were. They were essentially intended to be trading posts. And if you look at the great age of exploration in the cities that in Africa, in the Middle East, in India with Goa and Madras, with Timor, with Malacca, they were just trading posts. They weren't an empire in the sense that you took over a country, ruled it, and exploited its resources. And by 1935, beyond national pride, they had very little to do with the Portuguese economy.
So in 1941, we get John Reeves, the British consul, arriving. Who's John Reeves?
The British consular service until 1943 was a separate branch of the Foreign Office, unrelated to the diplomatic service. The people from the, quote, best families went into the diplomatic service. If you were of the less best families, you went into the consular service. And the least popular was the China consular service. The word was, if you'd been rejected from the diplomatic service, from the consular service, from the Indian civil service, you could still probably get into the China consular service, despite the fact they had a unique role, because in the 28 cities that the British had a presence in China, because of the very, what the Chinese call the unequal treaties, each of these settlements in these 28 cities were sovereign British territory. So the consul ruled over it. He was the judge. He promulgated regulations for it. Depending on the size, he ran a small police force. He could sentence people to jail. There was the Anglican Church, a British school. Chinese were restricted in coming there. He ruled over it like a small prince. Despite the prestige of doing this, there was a great document I found, a 1927 report on the state of the China consular service. And they went through the insanity, the drunkenness, the taking of Chinese women as concubines. I mean, these consulars, they couldn't be fired. It was a job for life. And so Reeves was into this. And his first two assignments seemed to be, the British settlement had been taken over in one case by the nationalist Chinese, and the other case by in the case of Mukden, by the Japanese. So he had very little to do. And so they'd given him unimportant things to do. And then the Japanese in early 1941 had sent a consul to Macau. And the British were worried because Macau is just across the water from Hong Kong. What are the Japanese? We need our own consul there. And so they took Reeves, and the Foreign Office document said, we're sending him here for a rest cure. So they obviously did, but they would put him there because Macau was of no importance, no interest to anyone. He won't do anyone any trouble there, and we can put him there and forget about it. So they sent him there. And of course, 5 months later, on December the 7th, 1941, or December the 8th, if you're on the Hong Kong side of the dateline, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysian coast, and the Dutch East Indies, as it was then, now Indonesia. And within 5 months, they had overrun most of Southeast Asia. And suddenly John Reeves finds himself the only Allied representative within thousands of miles. He actually has a piece about you could go 750 miles to Chongqing, 1,200 miles to Hawaii, and he names the other cities without seeing another Allied flag.
I'm slightly intrigued because he's not part of the Foreign Office. His duties are not necessarily diplomatic, were they? I think this in 1941 when he sat there, he is not a diplomat.
There was a rigid class distinction and status distinction between the diplomatic. He was there as a token. They wanted someone to fly the British flag. And suddenly he has to take care of refugees, 5,000 British refugees. He has to run spy rings. He has to arrange for people to escape out of Macau, to free China, and then to be flown to India. He is as I said, the only allied representative within that. And the Foreign Office detests him. There are two reasons he ended up crosswise with the Foreign Office. One of which is exactly he's not one of theirs. And then he went out of his way, unconsciously, consciously, or subconsciously, to annoy his bosses. There's a little thing. He insisted on writing Hong Kong as one word, as it was. In the 20s, the Foreign Office decided it would be two words. He stuck to the old one. And then he was constantly, as they say in America, getting outside his lane. So he had contacts with the OSS. He was told to stop. But the most amazing thing he did towards the end of the war, he put together a committee to decide the structure of the government of post-war Hong Kong. And he did this 80-page report, which I found in the National Library of Australia, of all places. And it goes on. He's got a design for the identity cards of Chinese, and he's decided where the buses were running. He's decided where the drains were going to go. He's got this whole organization, but at the very top, it's a traditional org chart with all its lines. At the very top is the British Consul, is him. And then he gets this smuggled to London, and it causes, you can imagine, it causes an explosion in London because they've got their own committee for working on what post-war Hong Kong is. And what is this little upstart doing it? And these documents that you can still find in the National Archives in Kew, these just frantic letters going back and forth. And at one stage, they're looking to see whether they can get a Catalina flying boat, the little two-engine Catalina, out of Colombo to fly to Macau to evacuate him and put a new consul in place there. And of course, it couldn't happen. It's Japanese-controlled airspace, and that was at the very end distance of Catalina could go. So they leave him in place there. But just furious. And then he had a reputation for being indiscreet. He would talk loudly within the consul about confidential matters. That came back. So could he be trusted with the confidential information? They tried to get a code book into him, but it finally got to him. But did the Japanese have it, et cetera, et cetera? At the end of the war, 1946 and 1947, they make him a consul in Rome. And you think, boy, this is Rome. But they give him only the outlying islands to look after. And if you think of Italy, war-ravaged, poverty-stricken, and what it was like in the outlying islands to get there. And then they send him to Surabaya. And Surabaya is the capital of Java province. But what happened in Surabaya was, it's just one of those weird, the last gasp of the colonial empires after the war. The Indonesians had risen up to fight for a free Indonesia. The Dutch were sending troops to put down the rebellion, but they were coming from Europe. So the British sent in troops in November 1945 to Surabaya to put down the rebellion. And they did it with great loss of life on both sides. The brigadier commanding it was killed. And even today in Indonesia, November the 10th, which was the height of the battle, is celebrated as Heroes Day. And then 18 months after that happens, or 3 years after that happens, to send the British representative there was an impossible job. I mean, it's like being the Hamas representative in Tel Aviv or whatever. A few months into that, he resigns and goes to South Africa, where he starts a new life as a sportscaster, and never to see his wife, never to see his daughter again, and never to see Macau or England.
It's funny because he's clearly very independent-minded, which oddly is probably why they sent him to Macau to get rid of him. But actually, probably served the position very well throughout the war. So I was going to take us back to, that Pearl Harbor moment. How does he find out about Pearl Harbor? I mean, I'm not sure. Does he find it out through the Foreign Office ring? I don't know how they communicated.
I don't know whether he heard it first on the news or he heard it first from the Foreign Office. I don't know.
I mean, what's his initial reaction? Do we know what they? I'm not sure. But not being part of the Foreign Office, they probably didn't have a playbook for him.
No, they didn't have a playbook because he was a consul. He was meant to stamp visas and take care of distressed British subjects and, have a reception for the King's birthday. The other job was to report back to the Board of Trade. There was economic and commercial things that the consular service had to do because you couldn't have a aristocratic diplomat grubbing themselves with trade.
Curiously, his wife's in Hong Kong when it's attacked, isn't she?
His wife got trapped and interned in Hong Kong. She's a sickly woman. There's very little mention of her, in his account of his time there. And they seem to be estranged. I mean, primarily because the second the war was over, she took her daughter, left him, and moved to England. She was fairly serious Catholic. They never formally divorced. When he died in South Africa in 1977, I think, his friends contacted her and she renounced any interest in his estate. She was trapped and it took a month. I mean, she had diplomatic status, but it took a month for the Japanese Foreign Office, the Foreign Ministry, to get her out there. And it was the Argentinian consul who finally got her out of Stanley Prison, or where the Stanley and the St. Stephen's School, where the British were interned, and returned her to Hong Kong. The ferry ran throughout the war between Hong Kong and Macau.
Isn't that remarkable? I hadn't realised that they upheld any form of diplomatic immunity, the Japanese. I'd have thought they'd have just kept her in prison. It's funny how certain nations stick to the letter of the law when they're blatantly ignoring it in other places.
There's a lot of discussion as to why the Japanese army did not take Macau. They could have taken it in 20 minutes. The Portuguese had 1,500 troops. So there was 60,000 Japanese troops in Canton province, now Guangdong province, just the north. It would have been a slow march in there. And, the coastal defenses, this will sound familiar to you, faced largely to the south. Right?
The sea.
Exactly. So marching just literally over the border would have been easy. They occupied East Timor, the other Portuguese colony, interned the Portuguese there. It's a little more complicated because Australian and Dutch troops went in very early in the war and took it. And then they took it back. Despite the Portuguese protesting, they didn't release the Portuguese citizens there until the end of the war. And so the question that historians ask is, why didn't they take Macau? And there's no definitive answer. It may be buried somewhere in the Japanese archives. But as far as I can tell, the foreign ministry triumphed over the army, the armed forces, who wanted to take it. I think it reflects Macau being of little importance. It reflects the fact that the Japanese had 125 diplomats in Lisbon. That was an important listening post for them. They were worried about their citizens in Brazil, which was obviously American dominated, but it survived. The Japanese soldiers would come in kind of with impunity to drink in the bars and hang out in the brothels. There was a unit of the Keppentai, the Japanese military police, there. And the governor just balanced all of this and bent a little to one side, bent a little to the other side, but in the end kept Macau neutral as a kind of an Asian Casablanca with spies and refugees and everything like that.
It did strike me as a fascinating potential for a TV miniseries. You could have so much going on.
And there were just fascinating characters that wandered through Macau at the time, ranging from, just on the women alone. The first women to be ordained an Anglican priest, 35, 40 years before the was ordained in 1943 in Macau. The Bishop of Hong Kong, who wasn't interned, he happened to be out of the country at the time the Japanese took Hong Kong, was hiding in northern China. There were 5,000 British refugees that were English and then British subjects from around the empire in there. He's decided they needed a priest. The only person was the Reverend Florence Lim, a deacon of the Anglican Church. He made her go to Macau, smuggled her out of Macau. Then after 7 days of prayer in a little town in northern China, ordained her a priest, sent her back to Macau. And she was the one who presided over the little Protestant chapel that's there in Hong Kong near the Protestant graveyard. And she did the world peace celebrations. Of course, the minute the war was over, she was forced to resign, demoted, and she went to China to preach. Had a horrible time in the Cultural Revolution, managed to get to Canada. I think before she died, the church apologized to her. Phyllis Harrop was an astounding woman. She lived in Shanghai, British woman, almost 6 foot, married to a German guy who treated her horribly, physically abused her. There's a hint in her book about she's still suffering the pain. Divorced him, moved to Hong Kong, joined the Hong Kong police, and was then the assistant commissioner for women's affairs. But during the Battle of Hong Kong, she watched the fighting. There's just a bone-chilling comment about, I watched the execution of 19 fifth columnists by the Chungking men, i.e. the nationalist secret police that had been sent in there. They certainly knew how to deal with disorderly people. But after Hong Kong's surrender, she stayed on in the Hong Kong police and worked with the Japanese Medical Corps to set up brothels. And she's got this line about it would be so much better than having mass rape to have professional women take care of the Japanese soldiers. And then it ends up with this line, let the moral philosophers make of it what they will. Then the Japanese looked at the divorce papers and saw the swastikas and everything, that come from Germany somewhere, and decided she was a German citizen and gave her a pass to live there. She took the pass, went to Macau, smuggled out of Macau into the French territory, and then was carried by a sedan chair for 6 days to the railhead that then took her to Chongqing, then to Kunming, and then flowing over the hump to the wonderfully named Dum Dum Airport in Calcutta. And then she made it to London, where she wrote a report about Macau, about Hong Kong, and a short account of her life there. But what an astounding story.
Isn't it just? With 5,000 refugees, British refugees, is Reeves, where does Reeves' responsibility start and stop for them coming in? Because presumably they're fleeing with the shirts on their backs.
Some were relatively prosperous that got there. They had moved their money from Hong Kong. They were staying with relatives there. Some literally only had their shirts on their back. The problem in the classic bureaucratic is that Foreign Office says, not my problem. Hong Kong's a British colony. Go to the Colonial Office. The Colonial Office wires him over the course £1.7 million, which when I did the math, when I asked Google what that was in US dollars in 2023, it came back with about 100 million US dollars. He had 125 people working for him. He had a bigger operation than most embassies, than a lot of embassies at the time. And he simply set up a criteria. How much money did you have? What your connection was to Britain? Some people were obvious, in that time. They were British, right? But he said one little comment he makes, he found this dark-skinned Peruvian who claimed his parents were from Madras and had worshipped in the Anglican cathedral there. He works out an allowance for each one of them. He sets up a medical clinic with 3 Hong Kong doctors, buys them medicine. He has spies going in to make sure they're not gambling. because he didn't want them to waste money. He and his staff keep meticulous track of this 1.6 million pounds. And in the end, his accounts, he cannot account for sixpence. His accounts are that precise that he cannot account for. But he had to find food, he had to find medicine, he had to find housing for them, and they all survived.
But how's that operating within Hong Kong? Within Macau? Because presumably, are the Japanese? Is it a porous border? The Japanese essentially let Macau operate, or is it cut off?
The answer to that is both. They essentially let it operate. They know they can go in at any time. The Japanese military police use the triads, the gangs, to spy. And, the communists use the gangs, the triads. The nationalists use the triads. The Japanese use the triads. So it wasn't a major headache for them. And they frankly liked the refugees there because then it wasn't Hong Kong's problem to feed them. Getting food into Hong Kong was extremely difficult. There was no farming in Macau. There was no water. Everything, food, fuel, oil, medicines had to be imported. And then, of course, there was a crop failure in 1942 in Macau. The ship carrying rice from Amoy, what we now think of as a Vietnam, was sunk by an American submarine. At one stage, they had 2 weeks' worth of food and fuel left in the colony, and the Japanese were threatening to invade. And the governor organizes this large procession to go from St. Dominic's Church to the cathedral, carrying the greatest Portuguese saint, Our Lady of Fatima, up, or rather, not a saint, sorry, the Virgin that appeared in Fatima, appeared to Fatima in Portugal. They carry it up to the cathedral, put it in a niche, and it's Our Lady, Queen of the World, Save Macau. And you can still go up to the cathedral and it's there, in there. But somehow they got the food there. There was a brilliant guy, Dr. P.J. Lobo, an orphan from Timor, became an economist that kept the economy alive in Macau. And basically what he did was set up a trading company. 1/3 of the stock was owned by prominent Portuguese citizens. 1/3 of the stock of this trading company was owned by the Macau government. And then he gave the other third to the Japanese army, which was a brilliant move. And anything that they could find, the little gunboat that protected the shore, sold to the Japanese. The Portuguese had 6 Osprey biplanes. If you look them up, they were obsolete in the 30s. And the bits and pieces of those were sold to the Japanese. Scrap iron, anything they can get a hold of was sold. But they kept Macau alive. And then, of course, pirates and smugglers brought in goods. If you were middle class or wealthy, you had a lovely life in Macau. And I found the only English language newspapers left that are still extant are in the National Library of Australia for Macau. And there's copies from late 44 and early 1945. And when you look at them, it's utterly fascinating because they're the ads. So you have American movies and British movies playing in the movie theaters because they're stolen from the American supplies and smuggled in. And you can get American toilet paper, Australian canned butter, Jamaican rum, cigars, and then the list of medicines. So if you've got the money, you could live a life. If you were poor, it was miserable. Very interestingly, it would have been fairly easy to close the northern border and prevent people coming. The governor made the decision, if you got to Macau, you could stay. And so the population in 1935 was about 120,000. Then with the fighting in China, by 1941, it was 300,000. And then by 1945, it was 600,000. They devoted all of the gambling revenues to taking care of the refugees, but scores died from starvation, almost all Chinese, every day. And the descriptions of more than one account of cannibalism, of the bodies in the streets, and black troops from Mozambique in their trucks being sent around to pick up the bodies, load them into barges, take them to Taipa Island just south of Macau, and bury them in a large pit. And in the meantime, as I said, the consul talks about milk-fed pigeons, and the restaurants were open, and Art Caneros and an orchestra were playing jazz tunes they'd heard on the radio. It's a kind of Shangri-La, Casablanca. It's a very, very odd existence.
Well, with thoughts of Shangri-La and Casablanca, Peter, we'll pause there, folks. We'll be back in a moment. Do we know how much direction Reeves was getting from London, or how much is literally just his reacting to the situation at the time?
Unfortunately, and I confirmed this with Richard Smith, who is the chief historian of the British Foreign Office, when the documents were sent from the Foreign Office to the National Archives, somebody went through them and tossed maybe 60% of Reeves's cables back and forth. I don't think it was malevolent. Unlike the destruction of SOE's documents after the war, it wasn't designed to conceal. They just made an odd decision. This isn't relevant. Nobody is interested in that. He got largely orders telling him not to do things rather than explicit direction. The spying was something he did on his own. Taking of the refugees was the province of the Colonial Office. They sent him the money and told him to get, they couldn't give him direction. He was operating independently, and anyone who's worked for a large organization, let alone worked for the government, let alone something relatively dysfunctional like the civil service, knows that independent thinking is not necessarily a virtue that's cherished and encouraged.
Well, if you do it independently along certain guidelines, you're fine. If you do it too independently, your ship has sunk.
Your ship has sunk. Yeah, exactly.
Now, there is curiously, we were saying this before we sort of started, a James Bond connection, isn't there? He has an interaction with, although I don't suppose he knew it was via Peter Fleming, Ian Fleming, creator of James Bond's brother, doesn't he, Reeves? There's a connection with Macau. Peter
Fleming headed MI9, which was British military intelligence. And in that kind of wonderful, creative way that has led to so many great books, ran a couple of deception operations into Macau, of which a kind of a composite version appears in my book. No, but he would not be aware of Fleming. The instructions came down through the Foreign Office. But his brother, Ian Fleming, running British naval intelligence in Lisbon, is just a wonderful coincidence. But then Ian Fleming came to Macau after the war. He's got a little book which you can find which is obviously he tossed off for the money in about 20 minutes. But he met P.J. Lobo, who ran the Macau economy during the war. And P.J. Lobo was at that stage heavily involved in gold smuggling because Portugal and Macau were somehow had got themselves out of the Bretton Woods Agreement. And it was a massive gold smuggling operation going out of Macau. There's a wonderful issue of Life magazine in 1949, which I found about the junks going up to China and as China collapsed. And Ian Fleming based Goldfinger, the character of Goldfinger, on P.J. Lobo.
Now, you mentioned junks there. How when the refugees are stuck in Macau, could they get out? How porous is that border?
The border was very porous in the sense that the Japanese Navy patrolled it, but the smugglers were going back all the time. And if you look at a map of Macau, almost immediately north, you got into a maze of little rivers and swamps and things like that. Now, up till 1943, until the Japanese occupied the French protectorate of around Fort Bayard, if you got the right ID, you could take the ferry between Macau and Fort Bayard, and a number of people did that. And then you literally walked over the border. You got a sedan chair, which would take you to a train, and the train to Chongqing. Just as a footnote of that, in one of the accounts of British soldiers escaping from Macau, they finally got into free China. as it was known. The officer leading the group walked into a bank, was put in touch with the British embassy in Chongqing, and then the bank issued him with a stack of money. And so that paid for his trip into Chongqing. He got to Calcutta, was in his billet, and then was integrated back into the British Army. Found his pay account. It had been deducted from his pay. But the answer to your question is that there are fascinating accounts of the escapes, of getting out of Macau harbor late at night in these snake boats. If you look up snake boats, it's essentially a long, fairly wide canoe, very low to the water, and then across into the slumps and out, and then dumped on some shore. Or you were in a junk below decks and then dumped on some shore. And then the consul, through the British Army Aid Group, there was this whole network that you were given money, but then there was this whole network of smugglers and bandits and warlords and communist guerrillas and nationalist guerrillas that would escort you through. And it was a nice revenue source for them. The consul's he counted over 300 refugees he got out of Macau, and not one was lost. Incredible. And it's like, for an American, it's like walking from New York to Chicago. When I did the equivalent, it's like walking from London to Inverness. I mean, this was a long way. I mean, part of that would be on sampans, part of that at the end, but you were lucky you got in a train. There is a wonderful manuscript in the Imperial War Museum that I think is going to come out in one publication in an edited version. But it is by the wife of the chief accountant of the Macau Electric Company. She and her husband, Colin, escaped in a group of 60 with their 12-year-old boy, 16 Filipinos, American missionaries, grandparents, children as young as 6. You know, they were landed on the coast of China. You know, you ended up sleeping in barns, in temples. You got lice on you. But she loved it. They would slip down slopes, their luggage would be lost, then found again. The bandits would come. There's a kind of between the prim and proper writing, there's a kind of an indication that she got fit and she found herself kind of attracted to her husband again. And there's this wonderful scene in which the women are in one part of the barn and she's washing and she's down to her underwear even more, and she's surprised by 3 men that come around, and she just giggles about it, you know? It was one of the greatest adventures of her life. She ended up getting taken care of by an American missionary that ran a leprosarium. You know, the children had to be carried on the backs. If you took a route that took you into Sichuan, in so many of the accounts, they suddenly ended up in this paradise, this kind of Shangri-La of waving bamboo and food and lakes and temples and broken, you know, just like you see in Chinese scroll paintings. And often there were accounts of meals that they had, which just astounded them. A little piece of pork and then the vinegar and the local food. And it was...
I kind of got the feeling the dangerous bit is the leaving part. Once you got to mainland China, once you're sort of through the crust, it's just a matter of traveling over a distance.
Right. I mean, traveling, you know, and the psychological uncertainty of not knowing anything about it. But yes, the fact that hundreds got through without a single loss of life is an indication. And, you know, the Japanese soldiers they're either on the front or they were in the large cities trying to, you know, the Cantons and the Shanghais and the Nankings and Manchuria trying to do that. And, you know, you spread 1 million people over China, they're pretty scattered. And so, yes. And as far as I conclude, the bandits were sufficiently, were bribed and they were paid off and they said, okay, this is good. I'll keep this going. There was an account, Pan American, which is a whole nother, had a base in Macau. And they continued their salaries during the war, but the guys got bored and they escaped. But I found the New York Public Library has the entire collection of Pan Am's magazine for its employees. And I found in the magazine a reproduction of the expense account they submitted for their time. And it's got the route. And it's just they paid off this bandit here, and they paid off that guerrilla there, and they paid off that there. And
of course, when Macau is eventually attacked, it's by the Americans of all people. It's the Pan Am buildings that are attacked.
It's the Pan Am warehouse, and that's actually true. And I was able in January 16th, 1945. The Japanese Navy is all but defeated at that stage. And the Great Third Fleet is coming up and getting ready for the eventual attack, and what will be the final attack on the Japanese mainland. They put a task force together, and they launch an attack on Hong Kong, Canton, the Japanese bases on the mainland around there, and they bomb not once but three times Macau. And in the middle of the war, they had a court of inquiry as to what happened and this and that. And it was the general fog of war confusion. Pilots were given contradictory instructions, whether they were given instructions at all. Macau was neutral, but the Japanese were there. Stay away from the city, but look for Japanese planes on it. And as far as I can see, reading the transcripts of what the pilots tested, they were flying over. They saw something that looked like an airbase, and they just bombed it. And they almost killed Reeves, and they almost killed the governor. Pan Am had the remaining aviation fuel that Pan Am had been stored in a warehouse near there. It's called a hangar, but it's essentially a little terminal that the passengers would get on the big Pan Am Boeing flying boats. That goes up in smoke, and unfortunately, they were looking to trade that for food and fuel. But there's an astounding amount of documentation about it. In fact, there's a book that's just come out, which, if you're really interested in that subject, goes into it in incredible amount of detail.
I think the American government even managed to pay out the Portuguese for the damage, which is remarkable.
In 1953, they paid $20 million to the Portuguese as compensation, it's several $100 million, including, when you read the claims, some of them look a little dubious to me.
No, towards the end of the war, Reeves is promoted, isn't he, to become a full consul?
And that struck, I never found the documents on that, but it struck me as very odd. Firstly, it was way before his time. One of the problems with the China consular service is promotions came excruciatingly late. You were 20, 25 years of vice consul. You were in the late 40s, early 50s, where there was a possibility of becoming a consul. Secondly, all promotions were frozen during the war. Thirdly, Reeves was detested. And so why did he get promoted? And the only reason I could come up with is that the Japanese consul had been assassinated. They were sending a new consul there. If they promoted him before the new consul arrived, he would have seniority over him. Now, that is my surmise, given the facts as to why he was promoted, but I couldn't find a document. The promotion comes very oddly, given everything else that was going on at the time.
Curious, isn't it? You mentioned the Japanese consul was assassinated. Who assassinated him? Do we know? Did they ever find out? Did they ever look?
As far as historians can tell, there was this great tension between the Japanese foreign ministry and the military, the army and navy. The most likely reason he was assassinated was that the Keppentai, the Japanese military, often had him shot because he was too close to the British. He was too pacific. He was the one who was arguing that Macau should not be occupied. No one has established that definitively, but he certainly had no enemies. And you could hire someone from the triads just to shoot him. So that would be easy.
Makes you wonder if Macau was a similar backwater posting for him as it was for Reeves.
Unclear on that. The Japanese certainly had designs on Macau before the war, designs in the sense that they proposed they would put an airstrip in for the Macau government. There were branches of Japanese banks there. They were looking to buy other corporations. The British government was worried that another commercial center to challenge Hong Kong would come there. And if it was Japanese dominated, what would that mean for British interest in China? Britain was still China's largest trading partner at the time. And the commercial contacts with China right out of Hong Kong were very important to the British government. The definitive answer is not, but the suspicion from everyone who's looked on it is that it was a hit that the Japanese army put on him.
Does that mean when, at the end of the war, if Macau remains neutral, it's potentially a haven for Japanese troops?
It's a little account of what happened to the Japanese, because there were Japanese troops left in Macau after the war. Colonel Sawa, who ran the Kepentai, the Japanese military police unit, was seized by the nationalists, taken to Shanghai and executed. Others were just, they were wandering around Macau, not very many of them, wandering around Macau, and the Macau and Portuguese government didn't know what to do with them. Eventually, they were repatriated back to Japan. But no, large numbers didn't flee into Macau. But there were people just kind of oddly left over in there.
Well, my final point really is he's made full consul before his time normally. But Reeves gets an OB. Is he recommended for an OBE or does he get an OBE? But but the question is going to be: was his services well known in the Far East at the time? And
again, I had to speculate on this. Why did he get an OBE and his promotion when he was disliked? Because he certainly, typically, those medals are handed out when you retire, right? Thank you for your 30 years of service. Here's a gown, as they say. Here's a gown. And he got that early. And there were a couple of things I found in the National Library of Australia in their documents. There was this wonderful story from the Daily Sketch, a now defunct British tabloid, about the consul who kept the flag flying. So it was beginning to be a little bit of a local hero. Then the Portuguese feted him, and they gave him some Portuguese medal, the name of which I'm forgetting, an engraved scroll. They gave him a beautiful sword with semi-precious stones in it. And so he was getting a lot of publicity. And I think the medal, they were a little bit shamed into doing it because he was getting all of this recognition on the other. This is my speculation because I couldn't find a document actually saying, we hate him, but we've got to do this. He was getting this attention. And to visibly screw him over, if you'll excuse the vernacular, I think may have had other repercussions. So they gave him a medal when maybe he would have been entitled to a CBE. They gave him kind of one below the top medal, which is a kind of a signal, and sent him on his way.
Well, Peter, thank you for telling us about wartime Macau. Loyal listener, if you would like to know more, Peter's book is The Good War of Consul Reeves. As ever, I'll put a link on the website and in the show notes. Well, that is it for this episode of the World War II podcast. If you have enjoyed the show, why don't you consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/WW2podcast. It's a huge thank you to all the patrons. Your support makes it possible for me as an independent historian to keep bringing these stories to life. As a patron, you get access to a custom RSS feed, allowing you to listen to the podcast ad-free. Plus, from time to time, I share exclusive extras, bonus clips, or interesting bits that didn't quite make it into the main episode. So if you'd like to join and support the show, head over to patreon.com/WW2podcast. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.